Hello, welcome to Bob's Dungeon. My name's Bob, I'll be your host. When you mention playing a vampire in a tabletop role-playing game, just about universally, everybody's going to think the same game. They're going to think of Vampire the Masquerade. The Masquerade is part of the World of Darkness, and it is probably the most popular vampire game that you'll ever find. And this, of course, is the 5th edition of Vampire the Masquerade. I haven't done a video on this book yet, but I plan to in the future. And you can play 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th edition, whatever tickles your fancy. But Vampire the Masquerade is just about universally the first and only thing people are going to think of when you mention playing a vampire in a tabletop role-playing game. Now, in this video, I'm going to do a list of 5 other games that are not Vampire the Masquerade that you could play vampires in if you wanted to change things up and do something different. Because sometimes it can get boring doing the same game. And Vampire the Masquerade, the setting and everything is set and pretty much set in stone. So you might want to do a different setting. Might get bored with the rules, want a different rule set. So we're going to look at 5 other games that you could play instead. But I'm also going to do some honorable mentions. So kind of a little bit of a completist thing. So let's go ahead and look at my honorable mentions before we get into my list proper. And if you don't want to do Vampire the Masquerade, you could do Vampire the Requiem. Again, I haven't done a video on this book yet, but I plan to. This is the 1st edition of Vampire the Requiem. Now, after 4th edition Vampire, they ended Vampire the Masquerade and came out with Requiem. And a lot of people were very disappointed in this game, and so it lost a lot of popularity. But there is a 2nd edition of this out, which I don't have yet. I plan to get it. And a lot of people thought this was a continuation of Vampire the Masquerade, taking place after the whole end of the Masquerade. But this is pretty much its own separate thing. So there's that. And if you're not wanting to do that, you could do Monty Cook's D20 World of Darkness. Now, I haven't done a video on this book either, but I plan to. And this book came out while the new World of Darkness was going. So it takes its inspiration from, of course, Vampire the Requiem, Werewolf the Forsaken, and so forth. And there are vampires that you can play in this game. The thing is, they're not technically your classic vampire, so it's kind of weird, but it's vampire-esque. We'll get into that when I do a video on this book. But it being pretty much vampires, you could use this as a vampire game if you wanted to do something different. And speaking of D20, you could even play a vampire in Dungeons and Dragons. This is, of course, the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, and there are lots of supplements and material in all the editions, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, that allow you to create a vampire as a player character. And you just have to look for them. Ravenloft is a good place to look. The monster manuals usually have a template that you could apply to make a vampire. So, you could run a vampire game using Dungeons and Dragons. And if you're not into that, you could use a superhero game. This is, of course, Mutants and Masterminds. And you could use any superhero game that you get your hands on. And with a little bit of tweaking, you could create your hero to be a vampire, a la Morbius the Living Vampire, and just run a vampire along with superheroes. There are lots of powers in superhero games that you could apply and use for your vampire. And finally, for my last honorable mention, if none of those tickle your fancy, you could use Star Wars. This is, of course, the Saga edition. And in Star Wars, there is a race of beings known as the Anzati, which are pretty much a race of vampires. But instead of drinking blood, they drink people's brain fluid in a very horrific way. So, you could, if you wanted, run a vampire game based in Star Wars, if that's your thing. And that's my look at some honorable mentions. Now we'll get into my list proper. And hopefully these will help you find an alternative to Vampire the Masquerade if you're wanting to shake things up and do something different. Kind of take a break for a bit. And my number 5, I've got Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Now, usually in this game, you play a hunter hunting down vampires, demons, what have you, while looking fashionable and so forth. But they also have rules in here for playing a vampire. The vampires that you could play in this game are pretty much the vampires from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So your only real supernatural power, would be enhanced strength. But you could die by walking into the sun. You could also die by being staked in the heart and getting your head cut off. But really, anybody can die by getting staked in the heart and getting their head cut off. So there's that. And if that's not something you'd want, my number 4 on my list is actually 3 games I'm going to mention. And the reason I mention them is because they kind of closely go together, sort of. But the Master Book, GURPS, and the D6 system. Now, the reason I mention these together is these are generic rules that you can apply any story to. So you could use them to create your own vampiric game, create your own powers, stories, settings, and so forth. But it bears to mention that in GURPS case, they did come out with a Vampire the Masquerade setting for GURPS. So you can play Vampire the Masquerade using the GURP rules. But you don't have to use that. You can come up with your own setting, own powers, and so forth. Do your own thing if you wanted to. So, the generic rules systems are pretty good for pretty much doing anything with. And Vampire is no exception. My number 3 is, we got to work for it a little bit. In Beyond the Supernatural, this is a Palladium game. They have a vampire in the creature section, and it tells what happens to you if you become a vampire. And usually if your character becomes a vampire, you become a slave to the master vampire, and your character is pretty much becomes an NPC. You could play it, but like I said, you would be a slave to the vampiric master. But Beyond the Supernatural uses the Palladium system, which means it ties into Rifts. Now, in Rifts, there is a supplement. That supplement is the Vampire Kingdom. And this is about a kingdom that the vampires have set up, and you go to do your thing. But there are rules in here for playing a vampire player character that's not a slave to a master. So you could use the rules in here to create your own vampire game using the Palladium system if you wanted to. So that's pretty cool. And you can also have a vampire appear in pretty much any Rifts games, in any Palladium game. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Robotech. Imagine the surprise there. For my number 2 pick, there is a game called Witchcraft. I haven't done a video on this book yet, but I plan to And this game is pretty cool. You play a spellcaster, and it's got its own stuff. It uses the Uni system, so it's fully compatible with All Flesh Must Be Eaten and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Now, the magic system in here, of course, is different from what is presented in the Buffy the Vampire Slayer game. So it's got its differences, but this book has a supplement, and that supplement is the Mystery Codex. This book has a section in it devoted to undead creatures, and each of those undead creatures, ghosts, revenants, and vampires, they're presented so that you can make them up as player characters. So you could actually use the rules presented in this game, in the Witchcraft core book, to create your own vampire game, which is pretty neat. They got their own powers and everything in here, and it describes how you become a vampire, which is a little different than in other games, but it's pretty neat. So you could do that if you wanted. My number one pick, though, for an alternate vampire game is Blood Dark Thirst. This game I really liked when I got it, read through it. It's a very, very small book, very easy rules, and it leaves enough open area that you could do what you want with it. Create your own setting, storylines, and stuff like that. And it would be very easy for you to use very quickly to get your vampire game going. And those are my 5 picks for alternate games that you can play a vampire in, other than the World of Darkness or Vampire the Masquerade. But by no means is that a complete list. There are lots of other games that you could use to play vampires in if you want to try something different, shake things up a bit. And thank you for joining me at a look at these different games that aren't Vampire the Masquerade. Hopefully you'll join me next time where we'll talk about something else. Bye.